Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in the Bondage of the Will by Martin Luther, published in 1525. We're going to take a look at the final lesson, pages 95 to 117. This can be the final lesson in this great manuscript. And last lesson we closed out the argument. That was the close of Luther's argument. So these remaining pages, Luther tells us, I just want to give you testimony from Paul and testimony from John supporting my arguments. So he closes out with apostolic authority on the doctrine of the bondage of the will. Let's begin by taking a look at block 1 and take a look at the testimony of Paul. And Luther begins and he says that Romans 1:18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. All men are under the wrath of God. All men hold truth in unrighteousness, says Luther. In Romans 1:16, just prior, Paul had written, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. This further supports that Paul was referring to all men, universally. It's a universal condition that all are ungodly. So then he moves on to righteousness as a need. Man in himself can work no righteousness and does not even know what righteousness is. In 1 Corinthians 1:23, Paul writes that the gospel is to the Jews a stumbling block and to the Gentiles foolishness. This further illustrates that man in himself cannot even know the righteousness of Christ. And then again in 1 Corinthians 1:24, to us who are called and saints, it is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So note 3, Luther wraps up here in Paul's testimony. Paul in Romans, plus the universal lack of knowing, means that we have the fallen nature of man being endorsed by and taught by Paul. In Romans 1:21, the wisest among the Greeks became vain in their imaginings, and their foolish heart was darkened, that they became wise in their own conceits. And then Romans 1:27 to 29, he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. In Romans 3:9, what then? Are we better than they? In no wise, for we have proved, both Jews and Greeks, that they are all under sin. Again, this is a declaration of a universal fallenness of man. And then Romans 3:10 through 23, there is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. And then Luther gives us one final confirmation in Romans 3:20, by the deeds of the law shall no flesh be justified. In Galatians 3:2, received ye the Spirit by works of the law or by the hearing of faith? In Paul, Spirit is set in opposition to the works of the law. Everything not of the Spirit is flesh. The human will without Spirit is wanting. Luther says the Apostle Paul confirms through his own teaching that the bondage of the will is the true doctrine of Scripture. Now, he wants to also take a look at the testimony of John the Beloved. So block 1 really dealt with the book of Romans. Now we move over to block 2 in the testimony of John. We begin with John 1:5, the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Human will is blind, says John. In John 1:10 and 11, he was in the world, and the world knew him not. John applies this to the whole race of men. Free will is the principal part of the kingdom of Satan. Then under worldliness, in John 15:16, I have chosen you out of the world and ordained you. Free will is guilty of all that is laid to charge of the world. And then John 1:12-13, to them gave he power to become sons of God, which were born not of the will of man, but of God. Not of the will of man, but of God. That states it very clearly there in John 1:12-13. And then note 3, human blindness plus human worldliness equals the need to be born again of God. In John 1:16, out of his fullness have all we received, and grace for grace. Grace is not received by any effort of our own. Grace is not obtained by the endeavor of the free will. The grace of Christ does not allow any particle of the free will, says Luther. The diatribe leaves less value and makes less value out of Christ's blood and grace. And then, of course, he is going to bring up Nicodemus. He is going to bring up chapter 3 of John. Nicodemus appears to have sought after Christ by the power of free will, but he makes a shipwreck of himself, says Luther. Nicodemus is confounded by Christ's notion of being born again. In John 3:9, he says, how can these things be? But Christ tells him one must be born of water and of spirit before they can enter the kingdom of heaven. This is a mystery hidden from the world. In John 14:6, Christ is said to be the way, the truth, and the life. Whatever is not of Christ is not the way, but instead it is error. In John 3:18, he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed on the name of the only begotten Son of God. And then John 3:27, a man can receive nothing except to be given from above. So obviously, that final verse solidifies Luther's position. We do not have a free will. We can't receive anything except to be given from above. That includes justification. It must be given from above. We don't choose justification. We are sought by God first. First, we are quickened by the Spirit, and then after being quickened by the Spirit, our heart is changed from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh, and then we will hear the gospel in a powerful, life-changing way, and we will be empowered to respond in faith because we've been quickened by the Spirit, because we've been born again before ever realizing that we can have faith in the gospel of Christ. Remember, Luther separated being born again from justification. Being born again precedes justification for Luther. But here in this closing lesson, he says, I've already proven my argument with the infallibility of Scripture and with sound, good conscience, but I want to give you the testimony of Paul and the testimony of John, and they will further validate that what I have said is the truth of Scripture. It is not a twisted truth like the diatribe does, but it is the plain, genuine truth of the Scripture from the book of Romans and the Gospel of John. So let's take a look at the closing comments that Luther has for us. And he says, note 1, from enmity to certainty, without grace man lives in continual uncertainty. God has put our salvation out of the way of our own will. In Romans 8:7, because the carnal mind is in enmity against God. And then John 10:27 and 28, no one shall pluck them out of my hand, because my Father, which gave them to me, is greater than all. The Father draws us to Christ first. That's that born again aspect, and then we can hear the gospel of Christ. And that's what John 10:27 and 28 says, which, because of my Father which gave them to me. Now, too, cause to believe. In Ephesians 2:3, we all were children of wrath, even as others. God causes us to believe in Him. God is incomprehensible and inaccessible by human reason. Romans 11:33 says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are His judgments." We cannot comprehend or understand the gospel of Jesus Christ unless we are quickened by the Spirit and our heart is softened. Then we can hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, note 3, the power unto salvation. Human power is nothing when compared to divine power. God ever was and is just, says Luther. In Psalm 73:17 and 18, until I went into the sanctuary of God, then understood I their end. Surely thou hast set them on slippery places, thou cast them down unto destruction. The wicked who now prosper shall be ultimately cast down, and the exalted minds will also be cast down, those who are prideful and have hubris. And so then he has note 4 here, 3 conclusions. We must consider the light of nature, which is solved by the light of grace, which leads to the light of glory. The light of nature is solved by the light of grace, which leads to the light of glory. And the light of nature would include the natural human will. It needs the light of grace before it can ever understand the gospel or ever understand the light of glory. So the light of nature, which is solved by the light of grace, which leads to the light of glory. We must confess that the whole man is lost, or we make Christ superfluous. Erasmus has identified the turning point of the cause concerning Reformed theology, says Luther. He says, I've challenged Erasmus, but I will give him credit for this. He did identify the hinge point upon which all doctrine swings. Original sin. If you get that wrong, all doctrine is going to be wrong. If you get original sin wrong, like Pelagian heresy and Catholicism, you're going to end up with a works righteousness where you have to work with the priest to secure your ongoing salvation and to be prevented from prolonged time in purgatory. So it all begins with this doctrine of the fallen nature of man. If you get that wrong, like Pelagian heresy in the Catholic Church, you end up with works righteousness. Luther says, but if you do hold fast to the doctrine of original sin and the fallen nature of man, then you realize that salvation is by grace alone, and it begins with being quickened by the Spirit. That's called being born again. And that is where you have to begin, or all Christian doctrine gets twisted, all Christian doctrine gets distorted. And so he does say Erasmus did identify the correct fundamental doctrine. The doctrine of original sin, the doctrine of the fall, is the turning point of the cause of the Reformation movement. So we get our closing testimony. We already had the closing argument in the previous lesson, but this is the closing testimony. And it's going to wrap up our final lesson. We will have a recall triad after this, but this wraps up pages 95 to 117. Next, we will have our recall triad.